And like so many of you politicos, um, goal, the challenge over the last few months, especially for the next 2 weeks, is I guess not picking up your phone every 30 seconds to get the latest update, to get the latest poll, to make yourself feel a little less anxious about the election, right? And you kind of go back and forth. And to some extent, I think we're kind of scarred from 2016 in a way, right? I think most Democrats are feeling pretty good about the election recently, right? Especially if you're more confident that the polls are looking good for Biden and that Democrats have a real chance of winning the Senate, right? On the other hand, a lot of people have what I call PTTD instead of PTSD, post-traumatic Trump disorder, from 2016, right? Where around this exact same time, 4 years ago, right, the polls were eerily similar in a lot of ways, especially the popular vote, the national polls, right, of the popular vote. And we had this kind of overwhelming confidence and figured we were using our critical thinking skills that seemed to fail us, right? Because we couldn't imagine Trump actually winning in 2016. And yet, 4 years later, here we are, right? Even many of the polls, like I said, are very close, very almost precisely the same as they were 4 years ago. Yet, there are a lot of important differences, right? First of all, if we go back to 2016, we realize that the polls, again, the national polls, were not very far off. Biden enjoys about almost a double-digit lead now, but that's going to tighten. Look for that to tighten over the next 2 weeks. Especially when it came to the popular vote, which of course Clinton won, the polls, as I said, last 2016 were pretty accurate, right? Part of the problem in 2016 was the scarcity of state polls, mainly in those three key states that Trump won, right? Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Also, there was on the ballot in 2016, there was a fairly popular third-party candidate, especially in those three states, that we know now diluted the vote for the Democrat, for Clinton. There were a number of other things. There were polling techniques that have since been corrected involving a lack of weighting for non-college educated respondents, right? We know came out pretty strong for Trump. All right. So I wanted to share with you, just give me one moment. I will attempt to do that. Let's see. All right. Can you all see my PowerPoint? Thumbs up? Yes? Cool. All right. So as I said, Biden has had a strong and consistent lead in the popular vote, right? The latest polls show him with that nearly that 10-point lead, which is important because even though we know that's not how the election is decided, we know there's a direct relationship between the popular vote and it being filtered down at the state level. I mean, if I'm wrong, and if most pollsters are wrong, and this doesn't tighten over the next 2 weeks, and Biden continues to maintain a double-digit lead, well, then it's very, very difficult for Trump to catch him, even when we sort of drill down to the Electoral College, to the states in the Electoral College, right? But as I said, the polls have been fairly consistent. I mean, if we look at the previous elections, and we look at, for instance, Gore Bush, we know the famous one in 2000, right? That was one of the few polls where going into it, the pollsters said it was 44-42. And of course, the result was quite different, right? Where Gore actually won the popular vote by a very small amount. But besides that anomaly, It was a very anomalous election, right? 2004, look, 50-49, 51-48, within like 1 point. In 2008, 52-43, very close to the actual result, right? So the green is the poll right before the election, and the tan is the actual results of the election. 2012, they were right on the money. And of course, in 2016, again, 43-46, it ended up being 46-48, with Clinton again winning the popular vote. If we go back even further, right? So this is very similar to the 10-point lead that Biden now enjoys, right? 50-40, Bush Dukakis. And again, that 10-point lead shrunk a little bit, but it was pretty close to the result of 53-46. Similarly, in 92, Clinton v. Bush, again, right on the money as far as predicting that. So polls, especially at the national level, remain fairly accurate of what actually happens on election day. But we know that the popular vote is not that relevant, right? It's all about the Electoral College getting to 270. Here's one of my favorite maps. You guys have probably looked at these a lot going on here, right? We know that each state gets a certain number of Electoral College votes. This is from 270 to win, which is one of my favorite places to play with this map and sort of look at all the possible roads to get to 270, right? And there are more states in play, especially recently, than there were this time in 2016, right? We could look at some of the tan states that are in play. Of course, you guys know, you were just saying, about your efforts in contacting people and really drumming up the vote for Biden in some of these key states that you were talking about, like Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, right? Let's look at the latest polls, right? Wisconsin, Biden has enjoyed a considerable lead in most polls, right? 51-43 was the latest. Ohio is extremely close. Georgia, extremely close, right? 50-46. Arizona, 49-45. So in almost all these states, these swing states, Biden is ahead, but within the margin of error. So they could really go in any direction, right? Here, let me do a new share with that 270 site, which is a lot of fun. It could occupy hours of your time, though, so I warn you. Right, so here's the 270 map, and this is an interactive map, so you could look at those polls and say, wow, you know what, my letters to Georgia are going to make a difference. I'm going to turn Georgia. I think Georgia's going to go blue, right? Florida, I'm not so sure about. My mother reports there's a lot of Trump lovers there, so I'm going to leave that red, right? Arizona, how are we looking in Arizona? Someone yell out, blue or red? Which way is Arizona going to go?
Blue.
Blue. Blue.
Okay, not what you wish, what you think. There's a difference, right? All right, let's turn it blue. Pennsylvania, let's give that one to Trump, right? Ohio. So, there's a lot of different paths to Biden's victory, right? Wisconsin, like I said, very comfortable lead. Michigan, a fairly comfortable lead, right? Arizona, even if he doesn't win Arizona, even if he doesn't win Florida, right? Even if he doesn't win Georgia, right? You have to give Georgia back, then Trump wins. But, there's a lot of different roads. The roads, of course, the path, the Electoral College path for Biden is in fact easier, right? If we start off, right, if we look at sort of the polls where Biden is enjoying a substantial lead, it would look something like this, right? Pennsylvania, I don't know. think Arizona has gotten a fairly good polling out of Arizona. Florida is really, really close. North Carolina is in the mix, right? So, um, you know, even if Trump wins Pennsylvania, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, Ohio, right, then Biden still wins. So, anyway, that's just one place you could kind of make your own sort of predictions. Um, let's go back to the PowerPoint a sec. Let's see. Where is my PowerPoint?
John did.
So, we look at the state polls, right? And, those three states that Trump surprisingly won, right? The so-called blue wall that in 2016, because of previous elections in 2012, in 2008, right? It wasn't even thought that Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan could go to a Republican, right? And even the poll. Oh, now I'm unmuted. Okay. Even somebody muted me. Even the polls in 2016, right, in Wisconsin, 51 to 43, they were really, really far off. They were substantially far off, right? Because as I said, of polling errors. But in places like Ohio, they were accurate. In Pennsylvania, they were off, right? The three states that caused Trump to win, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and I don't have Michigan here, but you could see the inaccuracy of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. However, the other polls, right, North Carolina, very similar to what it is right now, right? 46, pretty close. Trump ended up winning that by a little bit. Similarly in Florida, right? 46. Georgia, right? They're very, very close to what they are today, the polls, right? All right. So the polls, as we know, are just a snapshot in time, right? They're taken yesterday or last week, right? Ultimately, we don't know come November, for those people that haven't voted yet, what's going to predict, what's going to animate them, what issues are most important to them in choosing the lever for Biden or for Trump, right? And so I have a little chart that kind of shows the issues that most people um, uh, is salient to most people. In other words, what sort of motivates them to vote a particular way. So a lot going on in this graph. Let's break this down a little bit. The first group, right? We're looking at a bunch of issues. This is when the pollsters say, "What's the most important issue for you in choosing who to vote for?" And it's divided by issues that you would think would be important to people: healthcare, especially with regard to the pandemic, of course, economy and jobs. And those are the two issues that remain consistent election after election, at least recently, right? Since Obamacare started. National debt, immigration is the orange one. Environmental change, terrorism, and national security, right? So among all voters, that's this first group over here, as you might guess, healthcare, the big blue tall bar, is the most important. Immigration, the orange bar, is also up there. Terrorism, the gray bar, is also important. National security. Republican voters, as you might guess, are much more animated, are much more persuaded to vote for Trump based on issues of terrorism, national security, right? The gray one. And of course, throughout beginning with the 2016, the issue of immigration has been something that, Trump continues to sort of attract his base by espousing his racist anti-immigration policy, right? Which is why we see that orange bar being really, really high for Republicans. The only other group that you see, so these are broken down by voter groups. The only other group where you see that high, predictably, is Hispanics, Latino voters, who we know make up a substantial portion and will swing that election in favor of Biden or Trump in states like Arizona, Florida, and even Texas, which seems to be in play, which is just incredibly monumental, right? If the Democrats manage to turn Texas blue, right? And so much of that will be determined by Hispanic or Latino vote turnout as immigration issue that is voting against Trump and voting for Biden due to the immigration issue is so important, right? Among Democrats, you see, right, healthcare. That's the most important thing. It's been that way since Obamacare. It's continued to be amplified as Republicans and Trump have tried to attack and take down and dismantle Obamacare, and then coupled with Trump's dismal response to the pandemic, right? That remains just, that really stands out as the main thing animating and persuading Democrats to vote, right? Let's see, if we look at a couple of other groups, if we look at young people, the two important issues are environment, gun control, right? And this is piggybacking on the Parkland shooting and the involvement of young people in that issue, continues a few years later. And of course, older people, the most important things, healthcare, and again, terrorism and national security. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of show you the different issues that are important to people as they go and vote. All right, how about the race for the Senate? Like I said, there is a chance that Democrats could win the Senate. It's very close, but it's very important. There are a number of key battleground states like Montana, Iowa, North Carolina that are extremely close. In Iowa, we have Greenfield and Joni Ernst, separated only by a few points. In Georgia, Purdue is running behind, especially since his last week sort of racist way that he tried to pronounce the vice president nominee's name, right? And that's going to hurt him, especially among African-American voters in Georgia. Montana, the Democrat is ahead by a couple of points, and North Carolina, a couple other places. There's even talk of the Kansas Senate race, the Texas Senate race, North Carolina, South Carolina, right? So we'll see what happens. But I mean, basically, Democrats if Democrats win just these three states, right, then they win control of the Senate, right? They can increase their margin even more if they surprise Republicans in states where you haven't seen a Democrat elected to the Senate in many, many years. But what you're seeing lately, right, you're seeing a lot of these Republican senators in these competitive races attempting at this last minute, this very last minute, what are they doing? They're trying to distance themselves from Trump, right? And most voters, I think most people are like, really? Now you're doing that, right? You had months and months to do it. But it was only, it seems only at this, very last minute that Trump's negatives are sort of tied directly, they see it, to their electoral fortunes. So they're hoping maybe they could persuade a couple of, some voters at least, that they're not fully on board with Trump. I don't think at this last minute, though, it's going to work. All right. Last thing, I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you. I promise this will be probably the last one, right? Again, I just wanted to sort of show you the difference in voting groups. Because I mean, elections are won or lost depending on who turns out to vote, right? I mean, if we're going to have, if young people, let's say, turn out to vote in larger numbers than in the past, with this sort of gap, right? 29 versus 59, that's the largest gap. Biden wins, like in a minute, right? If women turn out to vote in higher numbers than they did last election, again, Biden wins. However, if, less educated people turn out to vote like they did last election, Trump could win, right? So much of it depends on which group is going to be most motivated to turn out to vote. That will determine the election. It always does. And of course, you have to kind of, you know, uh, drill down at the state level, right? Because you have to look at it in each state which group will be motivated. In Wisconsin right now, where you have a huge surge in the coronavirus, you had all the protests going on and the reaction to the protest, right? How is that going to motivate? Which group will that motivate more? Older, more educated, white suburban voters, African American voters in the large cities, right? Which group will be motivated more to turn out to vote? That's what will determine who wins a state like Wisconsin. All right, so I'm going to stop talking now for a moment, and I want to see if anyone has any questions or any topics for discussion.
Okay.
I haven't seen anyone type in that they have questions. So if you have a question, just type the word question into chat, or
Otherwise, I'm going to have to start calling on people.
Deborah Fisher Reynolds has a question.
Hi, Dr. Hoffman. Thank you. Everything's so
Hi.
interesting. Of course, I have too many questions. We all know we have to vote, 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 and everyone here in this group is. Some of my questions are for after Biden wins. How can we stop partisanship? How can we undo so many of the things Trump has done? How can we get back to some decency and norms? I keep hearing he broke this norm, he broke this norm. Does that kind of stuff have to be put into law so we don't have anarchy in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a tremendous job. It's going to take a really, really long time. I mean, there's what we call kind of like institutional norms that, yeah, I mean, new laws will have to be put into effect that sort of protect the people against an authoritarian type president. Because up until this point, we never had areas like, I don't know, just things like massively firing huge portions of the federal workforce, right? Normally, presidents do that, but not to the extent that Trump did, and put in all his political appointees at every single level. So in other words, could some regulation be put into effect so presidents can't do that as easily, right? That's one example. You know, I'm trying to think. There's certainly many things. Let's go to the 25th Amendment, right? Removing a president in the case that they're not able to serve, right? That we've discovered is almost impossible to do, right? Especially when the president surrounds himself by these sycophants, by people that will support him no matter what he does, no matter how unethical, immoral, or illegal it is. So can sort of the method of removing a president, can that be sort of amped up a little bit? Not to make it too easy, right? We don't want to, we don't want it to result in a country where we have these coups constantly, right? Like some other places in the world. But there's so many things that political scientists and government specialists kind of realize we have to kind of go back and now sort of put in place a slew of safeguards to prevent this from happening again. So yeah, I mean, see a tremendous rebuilding going on over the next couple of years. The second part about sort of civil discourse, we call it, or sort of getting together, not sort of hating each other the way we do, the divisiveness that you see in the electorate. That one is much, much harder to solve. The first one's actually not that hard, especially if Democrats win control of Congress. They pack the courts, which I think they should do, and they win the presidency. So the first part of what I said is not going to be that hard to do. It'll take a long time, but you could do it. The second part really gets into people's heads, right? And you're trying to figure out, how do we create a country? How do we create a population that could come together and isn't so incredibly divided, incredibly divisive? That's going to take much, much longer, and will, involve, a lot of civil discourse, a lot of grassroots people trying to come together. Your group meeting with a group of conservative Republicans on the Eastern Shore and having some sort of deliberative discussion, right? We could set that up at SU. We've done that before, and I'm kind of looking forward to the challenge of doing that, of trying to sort of meet halfway with people that we really disagree with, to try to begin some sort of healing post-Trump.
Okay, when I call your name, unmute yourself and ask your questions. Patty Stevens.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Hoffman. My question is, when do you think Biden should, and either of the candidates should or will announce any cabinet picks, and how might that influence decisions as we go into the last stretch?
Yeah, occasionally they announce before the election, or at least they start sort of hinting. And yeah, I mean, I think, but it's a very sort of delicate matter, because, in the case of Biden, he went through this in his VP pick, of course. In the case of Biden, on one hand, do you try to attract and really energize the progressive base to come out for you by sort of throwing names out like Elizabeth Warren at Treasury, more other people of color in various places, a Cory Booker, or some of the other vice presidential candidates, which would really animate the progressive base of the Democratic Party. But on the other hand, right, he doesn't want to sort of alienate moderates who he now really, really has in his wing. People that voted for Trump that are willing to give Biden a chance. He doesn't want to sort of play into Trump's narrative, which largely failed, right? Where Trump was trying to paint him as this left-wing radical, which it doesn't work with Joe Biden. So he has to be really, really careful. And I wouldn't be surprised if he waited until after the election to make sort of the major announcements of cabinet picks.
Okay, Terry Lajowski.
Okay, successfully unmuted. Yes, this may be, I don't know, wishful thinking or thinking for the future, but I just did a trip, as I do from time to time, from here to Washington and back. And I was really quite impressed with the number of large and small Biden Harris signs along the way. I've been doing that trip regularly for more than 20 years, like every couple of weeks. And I've never seen, I remember when we went, there was one point where there were a few Democratic signs, but I've never seen anything like this. Does this mean anything real for District 1? I've also heard that in Worcester County, I've heard this from people I know here around, that there are longtime Republicans sitting this one out. And I just wonder if you're seeing any of that, if any of this means anything.
Yeah, I mean, So, I mean, generally speaking, things like signs and even like numbers at rallies. I mean, when political scientists sort of use science and look at the data, there's not a correlation between those things. However, I mean, anecdotally, you can't help but sort of think, especially, and I notice that too. What I do is I go, since I'm in Salisbury, I go to the not so much the sort of middle class and underclass, go to the wealthiest neighborhoods in your county. And when you see Biden signs there that you didn't see Clinton signs in the last election, to me, that kind of, leads to the possibility that there is going to be a fairly substantial change in the electorate in a place like the Eastern Shore. I mean, look, you can't underestimate the radical shift and the change that the Republican Party is going to go through post-Trump. I mean, the party itself and individual voters are really going to be engaged in this identity crisis, right? Am I still a Republican? They're going to say to themselves, especially if they did not support Trump, right? I mean, look, a lot of political scientists are kind of trying to predict, and most will say that Trump will still have a firm hold on the Republican Party, even if he loses, because a lot of people sort of, espousing this sort of Trump perspective when it comes to defining the Republican Party will be in control. These people are still going to be in Congress, in the Senate, in state legislatures, right? It seems, what was it, in the Maryland Republican Party, I think they started, I think in the legislature, they started appointing chairs to their committees. And I think I read something that the chairs that they're appointing are much further to the right than in the past. So it kind of seems like the Maryland State Republican Party at the state, at the institutional level, might be moving over towards the Trump wing of the Republican Party. However, individual Republicans that I think you talk to and that I talk to, they're like, this is not my party, what Trump stands for and what Trump sort of did to the party. So it's like I said, it's going to be a major identity crisis for Republicans, I think.
Okay, Maggie Miller.
Unmuted. Hello.
Hello.
After looking at your graph where you said that immigration was an important thing for Hispanics, and then watching the TV and seeing Hispanic people holding up Hispanics and Latinos for Trump, I'm having trouble understanding why anyone who is of that persuasion and ethnicity would support him, given his very vocal hatred for Mexicans and anybody who's not white.
Yeah, I you could really kind of drive yourself crazy with that like cognitive dissonance, right? How many times in the last 4 years have you said, I don't understand how they can, and then like fill in the blank, right? I don't understand how women, how, whatever, fill in whoever, right? So it's complicated. First of all, in a place like Florida, the Latinos, a big portion of the Latinos are Cuban Americans. Cuban Americans always skew much more conservative, much more Republican than other Latinos from other, originally come from other countries like Central America and Mexico, right? So Trump Republicans always do well, much better with Latinos in Florida, because of the domination of Cuban Americans. That's changing a little bit. Younger Cuban Americans tend to be much more liberal, much more progressive, like young people everywhere. Other states, Trump has actually seen a rise in Latino support from 2016. And you're like, how could that be? Well, look, I mean, some Latinos or a good number of Latinos are motivated by issues of immigration. However, a good portion of them are motivated by other issues. Look, if you've been in this country for a long time and you're a legal citizen or you have a green card, and even if you're not, you may be more motivated by issues like the economy or something like that. And if you watch Fox News all the time, you're going to believe that Trump, is very, very good for the economy, that Republicans have always been better on the economy than Democrats, and that's going to motivate you, right? I know I had to get that little dig in Fox News, but even if you don't watch Fox News, right, this is going to be the perception for a lot of Latinos, which might be why you're seeing a small surge in Trump, in the support for Trump among Latinos. But that's not going to make a difference. I mean, just the vast numbers of Latinos supporting Democrats in places like Texas, along some of those border towns, is what is putting Texas in play right now for the first time in, like, I don't know, 25 years.
Arizona too, I would imagine. Yeah.
Oh yeah, tremendously, right? And I think it's Trump's anti-immigration tone that, is following the way we would think it would in places among Latinos in places like Arizona and Texas. But in some places, look, I mean, it's not, they're not just single issue voters, right? Like, let's say evangelicals, we would call kind of single issue voters, right? They pick an issue like abortion, and that's it. Nothing else matters, right? Not so much with Latino voters.
Okay, Irene Daly. Irene,
Okay, there we go. This has been very interesting, all the reports, but I'd like to know, what does character have to do with elections, especially this election?
A lot. A lot. I mean, it was probably, thinking back, it was probably in 92, in presidential elections, the first time that character became one of the really important issues that, again, sort of predict how people are going to vote. So, for decades, we've been analyzing voting data after the elections. And, we ask polls, you've seen them all the time. Who'd you vote for? Why'd you vote for them? Right. And traditionally, the factors that predicted how people would vote are the ones that you might, that you would think. It would be party affiliation, things like demographics, right? Education, race, gender, income. And then, of course, there would be issues like the economy, foreign policy issues, depending on what was going on during that election. But in 92, right, with Bill Clinton, character became an issue, because Bush made it an issue, of course, when when there began to be questions of sexual harassment that were levied against Clinton. And of course, he followed through with the Monica Lewinsky scandal, right? So for the last about 25 or 30 years, the last like 5 or 6 elections, character has very much been an issue for voters. For a lot of voters, it makes a difference, right? And it swings elections, right? Depending on what you think of the candidate's character. But like I said, I mean, that's a good sort of segue into what I was just saying about single issue voters like evangelicals, right? More cognitive dissonance, where you're like, I don't understand. How could a really religious person, right, go for somebody with that sort of character? And for them, in their mind, the most important thing is, again, obviously, the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to the court, right? Making sure Roe v. Wade gets overturned, and character is subsumed to a less important issue, right? For other people, especially for women, you see college-educated women, Trump is losing them in huge numbers, especially white suburban college-educated women. And it's not only me, but a lot of people predict that if Biden wins, it will be because of that group has changed significantly since 2016 and will come out in fairly large numbers. And for that group, one of the important things is character, right? Of the tweets.
all right, Sherry.
Morning, everybody. I have put a couple questions in there, but I'll start with the mail-in ballot one. Dr. Hubbard, what role do you think mail-in voting will have overall, or will it be reliant on each state's rules and ability to handle the increase in those ballots?
Yeah, I mean, well, they keep talking about, I forget what they're calling it, but the blue wave, which will occur, after about a week or 2 or 3 weeks after election day, when all the mail-in ballots are being counted, right? Because right now, when you look at the polls, it's something like 40-something% of Democrats say they're going to vote mail-in ballot, and only like half that number of Republicans say they're going to vote mail-in ballot. So you're going to have more Republican Trump voters voting in person. Thus, the results on election day are going to look somewhat lopsided, perhaps. Yeah, it's a really it's a terrible system. And when we were talking about institutional changes, I mean, there's going to be so many. Again, assuming Biden wins and the Senate and the Democrats win control of the Senate, there's going to be dozens of commissions set up to make huge changes. And one, of course, will be a voting commission, right? To try to deal with this incredible mess that is our elections that all occur at individual state levels, right? Where each state, depending on who controls their legislature, gets to determine how they do voting, right? How they do absentee ballots. Related to that, of course, is voter suppression, which Republican legislatures in a number of those key states have been working assiduously for the last 15 years, making it more difficult for people to vote, making it more difficult for them to have a valid absentee ballot if they don't have the signature, if they don't put it in the right envelope, if they don't cross every T and dot every I. On the other hand, a couple of the states are doing it well, who've done it for a long time. A couple of the swing states like Arizona, I know, have mechanisms and the adequate personnel in place, something like 20,000 people to work on these polls, to work up, to process these absentee ballots. So we'll see. I mean, there's been a lot of talk, and one can't dismiss all the talk of what will happen after the election if Trump tries to steal the election, right? Which could only occur at the state level. And really, the number one thing that will mitigate that and prevent that from happening is if Biden sweeps the Electoral College map, right? In other words, if he wins, so many of the states that he wasn't expected to win, like Georgia or Texas, right? Then it won't matter if they're arguing and trying to steal the 7 Electoral College votes in Iowa or something like that. So the sweep will obviate the need for us to worry about that at the state level. But barring that, yeah, I mean, it is of concern what's happening, what will happen when it comes to vote counting after the election.
Okay, great. Mercedes?
Good morning.
Morning.
Your answer to the last question was actually a perfect lead into my question,
Okay.
which was, is there anything that is looking at each state's voter suppression effectiveness and how that affects the polling projections?
Good question. Not directly. I mean, occasionally I will see that in comments and so forth. But yeah, I mean, that's an important thing to keep in mind. I mean, when you look at the polling projections of a place like Georgia and North Carolina, and they're in single digits, but they're in single digits in favor of Biden, I read those polls and I say, you know what? If Biden is up by 2 points in Georgia, I'll take those 2 points away due to voter suppression, and I'll say the race is completely even and it's anybody's race. So yeah, I mean, I do that all the time when I'm looking at these polling, but I haven't, it's only going to be after the election, right, where political scientists could determine whether or not those suppression efforts really had an impact. In previous elections, so each election they get exponentially better at suppressing the vote.
Right.
In previous elections, they've had an impact, not quite as big as you would think. It's been minimal, right? But they've gotten a lot better at it. On the other hand, there have been cases, and I have a feeling, again, just sort of anecdotally, looking at the news, looking at those huge lines of early voting, and maybe again, I'm in my MSNBC bubble when I see those huge lines of a lot of African Americans and people of color and women waiting for many, many hours. There have been cases where the notion of voter suppression, especially among African Americans, who we know have historically struggled to be enfranchised to vote, especially in places like the South. So there have been cases where the voting turnout among African Americans surged due to perception that my vote's being suppressed, my vote is being stolen away. They're trying to make it difficult for me to vote after decades and decades of denying African Americans the right to vote. So that's a possibility that seems to be being borne out in some of this early voting, where people are just like, well, we want to really be sure that our votes counted. So they're risking it. They're putting, normally they would stay home. I think a lot of people, I suspect the great majority of you voted absentee. I did, because you don't want to go to a voting booth, but you have to sort of put yourself in the shoes of somebody in a swing state. You might have slapped your mask on and said, okay, I'm going to risk it because I want to make sure my vote counts. So I think you're going to see a lot of people doing that in a lot of these swing states.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions. Linda Lindsay?
Yes, would you talk a little bit about the Lincoln Project and that group of Republicans that have become more democratic?
Yeah, that's been remarkable. So the Lincoln Project is a group of Republicans who, these were the never Trumpers from 2015-16 that we thought kind of disappeared as Trump, really enveloped and took over the Republican Party. But it's been fairly remarkable for two reasons. One, they've been extremely successful at raising a lot of money, and we know that money plays a huge role in elections, and running really effective ads. In fact, they were sort of, people were laughing and kind of criticizing that their ads were better and more effective than the ads that the Biden campaign and Democrats were winning, which to me kind of made sense, because as Republicans, they were able to kind of really get in the head of Republican voters, right? And that's the goal of these ads, to get in the head of the voter and convince them one way or another how to vote. The other thing I'll say about them is, they're clearly positioning themselves for the post-Trump Republican Party. These are people that want to play a large role in leading the Republican Party. Even if the Republicans lose, even if it's a blue wave and Democrats, and Biden runs the Electoral College Board, they win in the Senate, they win in the House, they pack the court, Republican Party's not going away, right? And as I said before, the big question is who will be sort of the leaders, who will be moving the Republican Party in one way or another. And you have a lot of Republicans in the Lincoln Project who are sort of setting themselves up as being sort of the alternative, the anti-Trump Republicans going forward.
And
What
Mary,
about Michael Steele? What do you think about Michael Steele? I
like him. Wow, he's just really kind of evolved as just, really, really smart. He's a great analyst. I think people like Steele, he could be easily Maryland's first Republican senator.
Ooh, no.
No, don't let it happen.
Mary Ann Wickham.
Hi. This follows up on some other topics that you talked about why people can be a Trump supporter. But in Ocean Pines, I would say there are some people who are upper middle class. They're not rich by any stretch of the imagination, and they're intelligent.
Right.
And I just, in my neighborhood, there's about 22 Trump signs and my one Biden sign.
Wow.
So I what is the appeal for these people? Do they think because they have some money, they need to protect it? Is that it above all things? Or, what kind of is the deal?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, it's complicated. You have to sort of, and look, we can make generalizations based on polls, but for everyone it's different. So if we make generalizations based on polls, we say that a group like that supports Trump for a couple of reasons, possible reasons. One is what you said, right? That they always perceive that Republicans are better when it comes to the economy and better at not raising taxes and so forth, even if they're not super wealthy. It would make sense for the super wealthy to vote for Trump, right? Especially when you consider, the tax plan that he enacted and a whole lot of other things. But if you're sort of middle income or slightly upper middle income, right? Many of the things that Republicans enact actually hurt you. But there's still that long time perception that Republicans are better at the economy, better at protecting your pocketbook. There's that. The second thing, which is much more sensitive, is the issue of race, is the issue of immigration, right? It's complicated. Political scientists call this a form of symbolic racism. I'm not saying that your neighbors are necessarily racist and they hate people of color. However, when you do polls and you ask people questions about welfare, connecting welfare to recipients of welfare, subsidized housing, public schools, voting rights for felons, decriminalizing drug laws and things like that, right? And then you connect how they answer those questions to other questions. You could get at what we call in public opinion research, this sort of symbolic, sort of indirect racism. And that, how you answer those questions and whether or not you score high on that are incredibly the most accurate predictor of your support for Trump. Again, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that all Trump supporters are racist, but the data doesn't lie as far as the connection between your feeling of resentment, right? Here's another one, right? That the statistic of whites being in the minority in, I don't know, a decade or so, something like that. So when you articulate something like that to somebody, that becomes a huge predictor of supporting Trump. So it's this sense of you're losing your privilege, you're losing your place in society. Other people are jumping in front of the line, illegal immigrants, right? And it's those kind of issues that really sort of animate the average Trump voter.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Sure.
having shown great restraint on my part, which many of you know isn't that easy, I'm going to ask you two questions. One, what do you feel as far as the voting of the students at Salisbury, percentage-wise, turnout, anything you know, and how predictive is that of college students in general? And then to end, maybe some comments on the Congressional District 1 race with Mia Mason and Andy Harris. I know that hopes that she'll beat him are slim, but do you see any chance of turning the shore more democratic in the future?
Yeah, two good questions. So for SU students, 2016 and even the 2018 midterm elections, we saw an increase by about 4 or 5% of SU students to turn out. And in 2018 congressional midterms, we saw an increase of about 8% nationwide of young people, millennials and Gen Z. Every election, political scientists and people that deal with young people trying to get them to vote sort of wring their hands and hope that this will be the election that young people finally turn out in numbers closer to the other age demographics. And in most elections, we're somewhat disappointed in them, right? This election, I don't know. I don't know if they're going to come out in larger numbers. If they do, what I tell my students all the time is that if they do, they control everything, because now, for the first time ever, millennials and Gen Z are the largest voting bloc. They're outpacing baby boomers for the first time ever, right? And they're just overwhelmingly Democrat and progressive on a variety of issues, role for the government, the environment, gun policy, so many things, right? So yeah, I mean, we say it all the time. If Democrats want just utter control, the type of control that Republicans have seen, right? It's attracting young people, and again, of course, having a candidate who is 70, it's hard to do. It's really hard to do. So we'll see. I don't think they're going to come out in like huge numbers. Like I said, I mean, the groups that I think will come out in large numbers, much larger than you've seen in the past, are like college educated white suburban women, African Americans, and groups like that. First congressional district.
Sorry.
Yeah. I've always said the only way it seems like one of the only ways the first congressional district is going to, if he's primaried by a much more moderate Republican, to sort of go back to sort of the Wayne Gilchrist Republican, which you might see. I mean, otherwise it's going to take someone, it's going to take someone like Jake Day, somebody who has, a lot more popularity, who has the money, where the state Democratic Party and other people in Annapolis really get behind the candidate and make a firm commitment to steal back, take the first congressional district, right? But that's, that's a pretty hard sell. But we'll see. We'll see in this election. I mean, again, thinking about what I was talking about before and the identity of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party, both at the national level and at the state level, sort of, having this identity crisis, how will that impact a Republican like Andy Harris, who, again, I believe for a long time is too right wing for this, for the Eastern Shore. You guys know it because, again, you talk to your neighbors who, I'm not talking about your Democratic liberal neighbors. I'm talking about Republicans. How many times have you, talked to Republicans who are just like, shake their head every time you mention Andy Harris?
When does redistricting happen? Before
what's that?
Redistricting, is it before or after 2022?
It's after the census, so I think it'll be happening before 2022, right? Because we just took the census, next year, right? And that'll be the other thing. Can an argument be made, right, for going back to the original lines of District 1, which made it more possible for a Democrat to win? But of course, after the last districting, when they carved out part of, what was it, Baltimore County or something like that, right, where they massively increased this tiny little sliver of the Western Shore, where Harris gets like so much support that even if a Democrat wins all of the Eastern Shore, all Harris has to do is, bring out the Republican vote in that densely populated part of the Western Shore to win, right?
So the
Can
Maryland.
a case be?
Okay, are you still frozen or are you back? I think you're back.